Hey guys, we're back again on aircraft again this week. And this time we're going big scale again with Trumpeter's 1/32nd scale English electric lightning kit. Now this can be built as either an F2A or as an F6 model. So let's open her on up and take a look. Set these aside for now. So, starting off, we've got two very large, very massive fuselage halves. Again, using my hand for a bit of scale. The say you're gonna be have to worry about a lot of real estate when working on this kit is a little bit of an understatement. Now, thankfully, the surface detailing is more than adequate on this kit, which in this scale is almost required. We do have several cutouts for different gun styles and or deletions should you decide on one variant or the other, which is nice to see. Also got some somewhat sparsely detailed air brake housings, a few other odds and ends. There is a little bit of ejector pin marking through it, but for the most part, it's not anywhere that's really going to be visible, save for maybe right in here in the cockpit area. But one or two ejector pins needing to be filled isn't the end of the world. And all things considered, you can't complain too much about that there. Next up, we've got a sprue of some of the air-to-air missiles for it. You have two different styles of missiles. Forgive me, I'm not super familiar with British missiles, so you'll forgive me there. But overall, more than adequate detail on them. I will say one thing: when I first opened this kit up, these parts were wrapped with a protective packaging, so it's nice that they did that to help make sure they get to you in one piece. Next, we've got our horizontal stabs done as two-piece assemblies. Not a fan of this style of tail simply because it does introduce potential misalignment. It would have been nice had they just done them as single-piece assemblies. As I mentioned before, we've got a couple different style of gun opening, as well as the deletion plates for them, depending on which version you want to build. We also got a couple of little odds and end parts, but again, much the same with surface detailing. Thankfully, you don't have as much ejector pinning as well. It just seems like it's primarily on that large fuselage halves, which is a little understandable simply because of the size. Moving on, we've got our main inlet parts. Again, thankfully, not too much in way of ejector pinning here, so that will save you on cleanup, as well as our wheel halves, our mains, nose, struts, and nose gear assemblies, and our main exhaust, or excuse me, inlet. Apologies. They only did the one since the second's not really going to be visible since it tucks up and away. Moving on next, we've got our main exhaust parts, and this is where I do say it's very poorly rendered, both here for the afterburner section, but also here on the exhaust nozzles. If we flip it around and hopefully it'll show up inside, there is no real detailing on the inner pedals. It's all just smooth plastic. So that's one area I would say if you're going to invest some money in upgrading this kit, getting an exhaust set would be an absolute must. Continuing on, we've got our cockpit, which the detail is more than acceptable out of the box. I would honestly say the cockpit is one area where you're not going to need to really spend any money, as the detail is more than adequate out of the box. I would definitely say save your money on a cockpit set and go for the exhaust. Now, on the main control panel, they've done an interesting thing, and we'll look at the rest of the parts that go for it a little bit. They've almost done like a photo you would with a photo etch. Instead, they've done but with plastic. So it's an interesting approach. Never done that with plastic. Have done it with photo etch, and it looks more than decent. So they've done an interesting thing there. Continuing on, we got our main gears, which for this scale is more than adequate. Main gear doors, again, still very nicely detailed. A few other odds and end parts and details, as well as our refueling probe, and obviously also our flaps. Again, would have preferred them doing it as single piece assemblage, but is what it is. Now, lastly, as far as the main plastic goes, before we get into this little box, are our wing halves. Again, give you a sense of size and scale, just how big this thing is, especially when you compare it to World War II aircraft. Again, much the same surface detailing, and thankfully minimal ejector pin where you might see it. And overall, I mean, they did a decent job there. So now let's get into our little box of goodies. First up is our clear parts. Now, unfortunately, the main canopy popped off on its own, but they're nice. They're clear, have no real complaints, so they should hopefully build up nicely. Now, as I mentioned before, and hopefully this will show up on camera. Apologies. But the instrument panel, they've done almost like a photo etch with a film, and then you sandwich it between this clear part and then onto the plastic, which is an interesting approach, as it allows you to both have the glass of the dials while still preserving the information printed on them. And you also have the added effect that it does produce a bit of a scaled effect for how far back they would technically be on the real thing. So it's an interesting approach that they've chosen to go with here that I like. It's interesting. Now, next up, we have two belly parts, depending on which version you're going to build. So this is something to be aware of, as one's for the F2A and one's for the F6. As on the F6, they delete the guns on the nose of the aircraft and move them down to this belly section. So be aware of that. Now, nicely, they've included a set of metal landing gear for the mains. Unfortunately, they didn't include it for the nose gear. And that is one thing I do wish they had included, as obviously you're going to need to try and balance this thing, as it's probably going to be a tail sitter without a fairly sizable amount of weight in the nose. And so it would have been nice had they also included a metal one for the nose. Thankfully, SAC actually offers just the nose gear as a aftermarket part. You can either buy it as a full set of the 3 gears or just as the single nose, which credit to SAC for that. I think that was a smart move on their part to give that option. Now, this is probably my biggest complaint with this kit, is these stupid rubber wheels. Now, thankfully, mine haven't degraded, but I've had kits that these wheels have already degraded on. So I would say another area to, regardless of what you do, is just cave and spend the money to get an aftermarket resin set. Don't even bother with these. They're not worth your time or hassle. Next up, we've got our two overwing fuel tanks, something that you really only see on the Lightning. And again, much like the rest of the kit, the surface detailing is very nice. Last part is our vertical stab. And this is, again, gives you a sense of just how big this thing's going to build up. Similar surface detailing, no complaints. Very nicely done. Give me a few minutes to get the parts back into the box, and then we'll look at the decals and the instructions. Okay, so we're given three sheets of decals. First of which is just the generic stencil markings for the aircraft, as well as the weapons and the large insignia. We then have two different sets of decals, one for an F6 aircraft and one for an F2A. Would have been nice had they marked on the decal sheet which decal was for which, just to have that added layer of idiot proofing, because somebody's going to try and use the decals off of one, not realizing what they're supposed to be for. Give me a second to get this back in, as I don't want the decals going all over the place. Moving on to the very nicely done marking sheet, full color for two different aircraft, an F6 and an F2A. Again, your basic European color scheme, no real surprises there. Now, the instructions where the kit does have some problems. We start in the cockpit, building up the ejection seat for building out the cockpit proper. We then start moving outward, building up the nose section, and then the wings and the mains. Then for the wheels. Now, this is where it gets a little confusing, and I think they could have done a better job of just highlighting the differences with regards to what parts you need between the F2 and the F6. Just would have been a little clearer, a little more obvious in some places. But as we continue, build up all that for heading into the rest of the fuselage. And then attaching everything together, selecting the weapons. And this is another area where I think they could have done a better job, as I want to say, and I'll need to double check references again. I believe the Firestreak, I can't remember if it's Firestreak or Red Tip, had been retired by the time of the F6. Again, I'll openly admit I'm not a super expert on British air-to-air weapons, so that is something to be aware of, and definitely check your references to make sure you're building it as you would expect to see it in real life. And lastly is obviously attaching the above wing fuel tanks. So overall, I think this kit does a lot of things right, but at the same time, there's a number of things it does wrong. I do like some of the extras they included, and I like how they executed some things. But on others, I think it probably the best way to describe it is it needs a little more polish. Now, unfortunately, Trumpeter kits do have a bit of a reputation. They're either really good or really bad, and this seems sort of in the middle. It'll be interesting to see once I do finally build it up eventually, but I'm hopeful. So that was a look at Trumpeter's 1/32 scale English Lightning kit. An interesting kit that does a lot of good, but a lot of bad. So it's definitely an interesting one. So until next time.